When you think of the most terrifying predator to ever exist, chances are you're picturing a megalodon, that absolutely monstrous shark that Hollywood loves to resurrect every few years to terrorize Jason Statham or whoever else is unfortunate enough to be swimming in the wrong ocean. And I get it, because on paper, this thing sounds like nature's perfect killing machine. A shark the size of a school bus with teeth as big as your hand and a bite force that could crush a car. Basically, if evolution sat down and designed the ultimate apex predator, you'd think this would be it. But here's the thing that paleontologists don't really advertise in those dramatic documentaries. The Megalodon was actually kind of terrible at its job. And I don't mean, oh, it went extinct, so technically it failed. I mean, this shark was so hilariously over-specialized and inefficient that it's honestly impressive it lasted as long as it did. In fact, when you actually look at the evidence, the Megalodon might be one of the worst designed apex predators in the history of ocean life. Let me explain. So first, let's establish what makes everyone think the Megalodon was this unstoppable death machine. Because to be fair, the stats are genuinely insane. We're talking about a shark that measured anywhere from 15 to 18 meters, or roughly 50 to 60 feet in length. And some optimistic estimates even push it to 20 meters, or 67 feet. To put that in perspective, that's longer than a bowling lane, and about 3 times the size of the largest great white sharks alive today. So yeah, absolutely massive. And it wasn't just long, it was built like a freight train. Conservative estimates put adult megalodons at around 50 tons, though some researchers think the chunkier individuals could have hit 100 tons, making them potentially heavier than most baleen whales swimming around today. Its mouth alone was probably 3 meters or almost 10 feet across when fully opened, meaning you could literally park a smart car in there with room to spare. I'm not even exaggerating. Someone actually did the math on this, and a smart car is 2.7 meters long, so it would fit with space left over for the shopping you just did at Costco. Then you've got the teeth, which are honestly the reason we know about this shark at all, since they're basically the only parts that fossilize regularly. These things measured up to 18 centimeters or 7 inches along the slant height, so bigger than your entire hand, and were serrated like steak knives designed by someone with anger issues. Each tooth weighed about 450 grams, or roughly a pound, and Megalodon had approximately 276 of them arranged in 5 rows. Studies estimate that Megalodon had a bite force of somewhere between 108,000 and 182,000 newtons, which for reference is about 10 times stronger than a great white and roughly 3 times more powerful than a T-Rex. So basically, if you were somehow transported back to the Miocene epoch and decided to go for a swim, getting bitten by one of these would be like getting crushed by a hydraulic press covered in knives. The scientific name for this absolute unit is Otodus megalodon, which literally translates to big tooth. Because apparently the paleontologists who named it looked at a 7-inch serrated nightmare and thought, yep, that's a big tooth, alright, job done. It belongs to the order Lamniformes, which is the same order that includes modern great whites, mako sharks, and thresher sharks. Though calling Megalodon a relative of the great white is kind of like calling an 18-wheeler a relative of a Ford Fiesta. Technically true, but missing some important context about scale. So with all of that firepower, you'd think this shark would be cruising through the ancient oceans, just absolutely demolishing everything in its path, right? The apex predator to end all apex predators, the ultimate evolutionary success story that dominated the seas for millions of years through sheer unstoppable killing efficiency. Yeah, well, about that. Because when you actually start looking at what the Megalodon needed to survive versus what the oceans were realistically providing, the whole operation starts looking less like a perfectly tuned killing machine and more like an evolutionary Ponzi scheme that was always destined to collapse. And trust me, it gets so much weirder than you think. See, the problem starts with the most basic question any predator needs to answer. What are you eating, and how much of it do you need? And for Megalodon, the answer was whales and an absolutely absurd amount of them. Based on its size and metabolic requirements, researchers estimate that an adult Megalodon needed to consume roughly 1,200 kilograms, or about 2,600 pounds of food per day, just to maintain its body weight. For context, that's equivalent to eating an entire adult buffalo every single day, or about the weight of a Honda Civic every single day. And that's not to grow or build up fat reserves for winter, that's just to break even and not starve to death. Now you might be thinking, okay, but it's a giant shark hunting whales. Surely that's manageable. And here's where it gets weirder. Megalodon wasn't just hunting any whales, it was specifically targeting baleen whales, which are the slow-moving filter feeders of the ocean. We know this because Megalodon teeth marks have been found on fossil whale bones, particularly on flippers and tail flukes, showing a hunting pattern where the shark would disable its prey by chomping on their swimming appendages first. Brutal, yes, but also a strategy that tells us something important. Megalodon couldn't catch fast prey. But here's the kicker. While this hunting strategy sounds brutal and effective, it was actually incredibly wasteful and energy intensive. Think about it. You're a 50-ton shark, and you need to chase down a 30-ton whale that can swim at speeds up to 48 kilometers or 30 miles per hour in short bursts. Then you need to bite its flippers off, wait for it to bleed out or drown, and then consume enough of it to make the entire hunt worthwhile. Oh, and you're doing all of this while competing with other megalodons, other massive sharks, and giant predatory whales that are also hunting the same food source. A study from 2022 actually tried to calculate the energetic efficiency of megalodon hunting, and the results were frankly embarrassing. The researchers found that depending on the size of the prey and the length of the chase, Megalodon could spend more energy hunting a whale than it would gain from eating it, essentially running a caloric deficit, like some kind of prehistoric fitness influencer on a permanent cutting phase. The math worked out to needing a successful kill roughly every 6-7 days just to stay energetically neutral, which doesn't sound too bad until you remember that hunts can fail, whales can escape, and other predators can steal your kill. And it gets even worse when you consider the competition. During the Miocene epoch, when Megalodon first appeared around 23 million years ago, the oceans were absolutely packed with large predators. You had raptorial sperm whales like Leviathan melvillei, which, yes, was literally named after Moby Dick, and had teeth up to 36 centimeters or 14 inches long, that were roughly the same size as Megalodon, but had the advantage of being warm-blooded mammals, and thus more energy-efficient hunters. You had other massive sharks, giant predatory fish, and the oceans were basically a battle royale for whale meat. So, here's this massive shark that needs to eat a car's worth of food every day, competing with dozens of other apex predators for the same limited whale population, while spending potentially more energy hunting than it's gaining from eating. But surely, it managed somehow, right? It existed for 23 million years, so clearly something was working. Well, yeah, it worked. But only barely, and only under very specific conditions that were absolutely not guaranteed to last. And speaking of things that barely worked, we need to talk about baby megalodons because, oh boy, this is where the whole operation really starts falling apart. Here's the thing about megalodon reproduction that scientists discovered by studying growth rings in fossilized vertebrae. This shark grew fast, like absurdly fast. Research published in 2020 found that juvenile megalodons grew at a rate of about 16 centimeters or 6 inches per year during their early life stages. Now that might not sound too crazy until you realize that great white sharks, which are already considered fast-growing, only grow about 25 to 30 centimeters per year total, and they're way smaller. But here's where it gets absolutely bonkers. This rapid growth meant that young megalodons needed almost as much food as adults, despite being way less efficient at hunting. Picture this, you're a teenage megalodon, maybe 8 meters or 26 feet long, which sounds impressive until you realize you're trying to take down the same 30-ton baleen whales as your 18-meter parents. But you're slower, weaker, have smaller teeth, worse hunting skills, and basically every disadvantage you could have. It's like if a middle schooler had to eat the same amount as a professional bodybuilder, but could only shop at the grocery store during peak hours, when all the good food was already taken. This created what researchers call a juvenile bottleneck, and the numbers are genuinely depressing. Based on the fossil record and what we know about shark reproduction, scientists estimate that Megalodon had one of the highest juvenile mortality rates of any apex predator we've studied. We're talking potentially 90% or higher mortality before reaching adulthood. So Megalodon basically had to reproduce like crazy just to maintain stable population numbers, which requires, you guessed it, even more food for pregnant females. But wait, because it somehow gets weirder. That same 2022 study that calculated the hunting efficiency also discovered that Megalodon likely had some degree of regional endothermy. Basically, it could warm certain parts of its body above the ambient water temperature, similar to modern great whites and mako sharks. This is actually pretty cool and helps with muscle performance, making you a faster, more efficient predator. Except here's the problem. Maintaining elevated body temperature requires even more food. The researchers estimated that endothermy increased Megalodon's daily caloric requirements by about 20%, which when you're already eating a Honda Civic per day, means you now need to eat a Honda Civic plus a motorcycle, and this wasn't optional. If Megalodon didn't maintain that body temperature, its hunting efficiency would drop, which means it would catch less food, which means it couldn't maintain body temperature, which creates a death spiral of starvation. And here's the real kicker that basically summarizes how ridiculous this whole situation was. Because of all these factors, the massive food requirements, the rapid growth, the terrible juvenile survival, the need for temperature regulation, an adult Megalodon probably couldn't go more than 2 weeks without a successful hunt before entering starvation territory. 2 weeks. This supposed ultimate apex predator was basically 2 bad weeks away from dying at any given moment. Oh, and one more thing that I almost forgot to mention because there's just so much wrong here. Megalodon was apparently also incredibly picky about where it could hunt. Because it was so massive and needed specific temperature conditions for that endothermy to work, it was largely restricted to coastal and offshore temperate waters between roughly 1 to 200 meters deep. It couldn't hunt in the deep ocean where many whales migrate for feeding, and it couldn't handle the cold polar waters where seasonal whale populations would gather. So this shark that needed to eat constantly could only hunt in specific geographical locations during specific times of year. I mean, at this point you have to wonder, how did this thing even survive as long as it did? Here's where the whole Megalodon situation goes from inefficient predator to evolutionary dead end waiting to happen. Because all of those problems I just mentioned, the insane food requirements, the restricted habitat, the terrible juvenile survival, the competition, those were manageable as long as ocean conditions stayed relatively stable. But around 3 to 4 million years ago, several things happened almost simultaneously that basically created a perfect storm of problems specifically designed to kill megalodons. First, global temperatures started dropping as Earth entered a cooling phase leading up to the Pleistocene ice ages. This doesn't sound too dramatic until you remember that Megalodon needed those warm, temperate coastal waters to maintain its body temperature and hunt effectively. As the oceans cooled, those prime hunting grounds started shrinking, pushing Megalodon into an increasingly restricted range. It's like if someone took your already limited grocery store options and started closing half of them. Second, and this is honestly kind of poetic, whale populations started evolving faster swimming speeds and better predator detection specifically because of Megalodon hunting pressure. Essentially, every whale that Megalodon ate was selecting for faster, smarter, more evasive whales in the next generation. The shark was creating an evolutionary arms race that it was destined to lose because whales reproduce faster and adapt quicker than a predator that takes 25 years to reach sexual maturity. Studies of whale fossils from this period show a measurable increase in vertebral robustness and changes in flipper structure that would have made them significantly harder to disable with the classic Megalodon bite the appendages strategy. Third, and this is where it gets really interesting from a modern perspective, whale populations started migrating into polar waters to feed on the increasingly abundant krill populations that thrived in cold water. Remember how I mentioned Megalodon couldn't handle cold water? Yeah, so now its primary food source is hanging out in exactly the places it can't go. It's like if all the grocery stores moved to a neighborhood where your car doesn't work and public transit doesn't run. But the final nail in the coffin, and this is honestly the most fascinating part, came from the rise of a more efficient predator that's still around today, the great white shark. Now, great whites are obviously way smaller than Megalodon, typically maxing out at about 6 meters or 20 feet and maybe 2 tons. But here's what they had that Megalodon didn't: adaptability. Great whites could survive on a fraction of the food, roughly 30 kilograms or 66 pounds per day, compared to Megalodon's 1,200 kilograms, could handle a much wider range of temperatures, could hunt smaller prey more efficiently, and most importantly, could actually chase down faster-moving fish and marine mammals. They were basically everything Megalodon wasn't: flexible, efficient, and resilient to environmental change. There's even evidence that great whites and their relatives started directly competing with juvenile megalodons for food. And given that young megalodons were already struggling in the survival department with that 90% mortality rate, this extra pressure likely devastated recruitment into adult populations. When your species already has trouble getting babies to adulthood, having a more efficient competitor show up is basically a death sentence. The current best estimate puts Megalodon's extinction at around 3.6 million years ago, and what's remarkable is that we can actually trace the decline in the fossil record. Megalodon teeth become increasingly rare in geological layers, and their geographic distribution contracts noticeably before disappearing entirely. This wasn't a sudden catastrophic extinction. Like the dinosaurs, it was a slow decline as the shark's evolutionary strategy just stopped working. So let's circle back to that original question. Was Megalodon really the ultimate apex predator that everyone thinks it was? And honestly, the answer is a pretty solid not really, and also, it's kind of sad when you think about it. Don't get me wrong, for the roughly 23 million years it existed, Megalodon was absolutely the biggest, baddest shark in the ocean, and any individual whale that encountered one was having an objectively terrible day. But being scary and being successful are two very different things in evolutionary terms. Megalodon's entire existence was basically a high-wire act of eat constantly or die that only worked as long as environmental conditions stayed exactly the same. Whale populations remained abundant in warm waters, and no more efficient competitors showed up. The moment the oceans cooled, the moment whales got faster, the moment a shark that could survive on 66 pounds of food per day instead of 2,600 pounds appeared, it was over. And that's actually a pretty important lesson about evolution that applies to way more than just extinct sharks. Bigger isn't always better. Specialization is a double-edged sword, and sometimes the most impressive predator is actually the most vulnerable one. The great white survived the exact same environmental changes that killed Megalodon and is still thriving today, which honestly feels like the universe's way of saying that efficiency beats raw power every single time. So, the next time you see a Megalodon in a movie terrorizing submarines or time traveling to eat modern cruise ships or whatever nonsense Hollywood has cooked up, just remember, in reality, this shark was basically running on a treadmill its entire life, one bad hunting week away from catastrophe, unable to adapt to change, and ultimately outlasted by a shark a fraction of its size that figured out the secret to long-term success isn't being the biggest or the strongest. It's being able to survive on the dollar menu when times get tough. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed learning about overhyped prehistoric predators that were actually kind of bad at their jobs, check out my video on why Smilodon probably couldn't actually use those saber teeth properly without dislocating its jaw. Because honestly, when you look at the biomechanics, it's a miracle those cats caught anything at all.